Hey, thanks for listening, folks. This is Michael for SNN, Southern Nationalist Network. And today I'm on the phone with Bill Buppert. He's the proprietor of ZeroGov.com. He's a retired officer from the U.S. Army, and he lives out in the Southwest with his wife. They do homeschooling there. He's written for many websites, including LouRockwell.com, and has spoken at various pro-liberty events. So, Mr. Buppert, it's great to talk to you.
Hey, you too. It's such a pleasure to be on your show, Mike.
We have several things I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you a little bit. You describe yourself as an anarchist, which is different than most people I've had on in the past. And I also want to talk a little bit about the South and secession. So these three topics. Let's get into it.
Good.
First of all, I believe that you have some pretty important Southern figures in your distant family. Is that correct?
Well, I do. As a matter of fact, as a result of marriage, because it's hard for me to trace any lineage to on my side, but my wife is a blood relative of Stonewall Jackson, as a matter of fact, and a blood relative of a number of Confederate soldiers and heroes and such who fought in the War of Northern Aggression.
That's interesting. I've been to General Jackson's home there in the Shenandoah Valley. Have you ever made it out there? It's just a beautiful place.
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I was at I went to the Confederate Museum out in Richmond. Let's see, what was it? About 6 months ago. Had a great time doing that, and I've been to Shenandoah. I've been to Gettysburg, which left me quite conflicted because I can feel the ghosts there, and I know which ghosts had virtue and which didn't, and those which had virtue, of course, hailed from the south, and those which did not, of course, hailed from the north.
I've never been there myself, but I can imagine. I can understand how you're feeling there.
To go further on, if I may, Michael, my wife does have blood relatives. She hails from Nashville, Tennessee, and her family is from both Nashville and Mississippi. And I was also a professor of military science at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, in Oxford, Mississippi, in what had been the rebel battalion until they reflagged themselves. So I've spent a large part of my adult life studying military history, and I've always found the War of Northern Aggression rather interesting. And we've been on a number of staff rides professionally in the U.S. Army where we study the battles and such. So, you know, I like to tell people who have seen the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales, I tell them there's an example of where the Confederate diaspora after 1865 headed west to get out from under the boot and the carpetbaggers that went from the north and occupied the South during the very awful Reconstruction years. And I tell them, you know, the Confederacy and what they sought at that time, when you strip it of all its bunting and all the great songs like the Bonnie Blue, in the end, they were simply a people who wanted to establish their self-determination and do it at a local level. And that the Confederacy isn't simply being a member of a region, but it's a state of mind. When I served in Bosnia and Kosovo, and even when I was in Southeast Asia, I saw the stars and bars flying around the globe.
That's interesting.
It is a universal sign of defiance.
Right, absolutely. I've seen pictures from the fall of the Berlin Wall of Confederate flags there in the crowd as the people tore down the Berlin Wall. And that's inspiring. How were you received there at Ole Miss? I'm just curious. That had to be an interesting experience teaching there.
Oh, it was terrific. But, of course, it's a Southern university, and it prides itself on, if I may use the patois, of being the Harvard of the South. They like to have that pretense. And
right.
It was wonderful, and it was great because the Confederate Veterans Association and various clubs and stuff were quite active. As a matter of fact, I went to a number of ceremonies that they held at Confederate burials and graveyards and such. I got to visit, you know, Confederate battle sites while I was there, and you know, down there the war is alive and well. I mean, it hasn't faded. People still they fly their colors, and they talk about Yankees in a rather desultory and sometimes insulting fashion if drink is on the table. Besides the South's holy water, which is sweet tea, of course.
Right. I'm curious, have you always been sympathetic to the South, or is this something that you came through came to being there at Ole Miss, or how did you become kind of sympathetic to the South?
I would say that my sympathy has always been there because a lot of folks tend to have a sympathy for the underdog, and certainly in history we've seen that even though in the first 3 years of the conflict the South prevailed tactically, operationally, and strategically, in the end it was a forlorn hope for them to win against an industrialized North that was so powerful in both its ability to produce things across the board and the sheer numbers that it had on its side, and the fact that the South had failed by 1863 to get diplomatic recognition from some of the great powers in Europe who did want to see the Yankees from the North fail. But apparently that was not destined to happen, and I've always studied it from a military perspective. I've studied it from a sociological and political perspective, and I've always I've been conflicted about Jeff Davis. I've never been conflicted about Alexander Stephens. And if you look at some of the fighting formations around the world in World War I, World War II, and such, you'll find that the German Blitzkrieg was informed by Forrest's cavalry tactics, in that when they were talking about combined arms warfare in the OKW, the German General Staff, they were saying, well, what are some historical examples that we can draw from to show how we can get there to a fight very quickly, overwhelm, flank, and take out the enemy in an effective fashion? And it just happened to be that Forrest was one of their inspirations that they used as an operational template to succeed in what they did.
I wasn't aware of that, but then I've never studied military history the way that you have. That's interesting.
Well, you know, I live in southern Arizona, and I hail from North Idaho. And from North Idaho to southern Arizona, you will see stars and bars, Bonnie Blues, and those kind of flags flying everywhere. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, they are a symbol of national or even local defiance to tyranny. And where I live here in southern Arizona, I'm also a guest lecturer in irregular warfare and guerrilla warfare and insurgency and counterinsurgency. And I find that the very best bloodless practicum I can use to transmit the ideas of either how to do that effectively or how it's not done well is to study history. So I find myself drawn to the War of Northern Aggression on more than one occasion to tease out those illustrations to show how one can either be a more effective military or to point that to obvious ways in which a military defeats itself through its bad behavior.
Maybe in the future sometime we could go into that a bit more. That's fascinating that you know all these things.
Well, I'd like to do that. And it is a bit off topic, but I'd be honored to come on your show again and just discuss irregular warfare, counterinsurgency and such, because the one thing I try to put across is that America as a country, culturally and militarily, is incapable of conducting effective counterinsurgency. We will never win in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right. Well, if the goal is to oppress the native people there, then, I don't want it to be misunderstood as supporting the Taliban or anything, but I wouldn't want the federal government to win if their goal is oppression.
I agree 100%. I can't think of any other reason for our being over there except for that. And unfortunately, you and I, Michael, will find among our southern brethren that there's an almost knee-jerk apocalyptic nationalism when it comes to national defense in the military, where they find it very hard to criticize. They find it very hard to say that once America has committed its troops overseas, that they almost find it to be a form of treason to even levy the slightest criticism about their presence there. And I think that as Southerners, as Confederates, as people who want to enjoy liberty and freedom and pass it on to their children and grandchildren, they've got to change their minds about that. Absolutely.
Yeah, you hear people say criticize the war, but not the troops. But in practice, I don't know how that's done, because anytime that I voice opposition,
I don't either.
Yeah. Anytime I voice
opposition, the only way to support the troops is to bring them home.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to the topic of secession. I know that this is something that you and we've discussed a little bit on your forum. And I do want to mention that if you go to zerogov.com, there's a forum there. There's even one section of there all about the South that I try to administer, but it's a great forum. And the subject of secession has come up numerous times. Let's talk about that for a little bit. It probably, I guess it surprises some folks, given that your background in the military, that you would support secession. So why is it that you would support secession?
Well, first of all, we got to remember that there was a Marine general by the name of Smedley Butler who wrote a book called War is a Racket. He talks about the fact that he spent almost 30-plus years in uniform, and in the end, he discovered that the only thing he had been fighting for was political aggrandizement of the American polity and the American government, and for whatever corporations had lobbying interests strong enough to use the strong arm of the Marine Corps or the Army to get their way in Central America and Cuba and places like that. I used to think, earlier in my adulthood, that was just some wacky leftist canard, and I am by no means a man of the left then, nor have I become a man of the left. But I think they've got something going on with their critiques of the military-industrial complex. So, for a former military officer, I'm not alone in this perspective. And remember, we're the ones who actually pay the heavy penalty and bleed and see our colleagues bleed for things that, on reflection, may not be as honorable as we set out to do in the first place.
Yeah.
As far as secession is concerned,
yes,
I have always been a supporter of secession on several levels. Let's use a very simplistic example. If Michael, you're not married, are you?
No, I'm not.
Let's suppose Michael was married, and he had an absolute blissful relationship for 3 years. But over that 3 years, irreconcilable differences emerged in which you could no longer coexist and live under the same roof with this person you had married. She just turned into someone that you didn't picture happening when you were there on the altar on your wedding day. You file for divorce. Instead of being granted a divorce, what happens is the government comes in and they manhandle you. Maybe they even kidnap you and take you to jail. And they screw a gun to your head and they say, if you ever threaten to leave that woman, we're going to make sure you remember this day for the rest of your life. And they will keep doing that again and again as long as you plead for a divorce from this person. Because in the end, all secession is another manifestation of the natural progress of nations in the Western world. And I say the Western world because I'm just not as well acquainted with the Eastern world, so I don't want to talk out of my own realm of understanding. In the Western world, for over 5 millennia, nation-states have been calved and birthed from the destruction, annihilation, or breaking up of other nation-states. That is the way of the world. Secession is the way of the world. And if there's any virtuous political arrangement, that virtuous political arrangement must be one where you can have a divorce in peace. Because if you can't have a divorce in peace, that makes you a slave. And the reason that makes you a slave, and we've been discussing this on the forums, and it's been interesting, is that, think of this, if you don't have the opportunity to opt out of something, do you truly have self-ownership?
That's a good point. No, you certainly don't.
Now, all of us, you and I and members of your audience realize that if we don't pay our taxes, we're going to pay a very heavy penalty, no matter how arcane and sophisticated the legal arguments that are levied against the income tax. I think it's just as wrong as the next man. But nonetheless, I have no choice but to pay it. Because if I don't pay it, I'll pay a different penalty that I'm not going to like very much at all. The same applies to those flashing lights in your car's rearview mirror. If you don't stop, Michael, they're going to kill you. The same applies to when you don't comply with a regulation or a number of regulations when you open a business. Right now, I have a friend, for instance, who's a plumber, and this is probably the same case for where you are, even though you and I hail from different states. He says that 57 cents to 62 cents out of every dollar that he brings in receipts for his business must be given to another government entity, and he isn't even paid for the collection service. And if he fails to pay any one of those entities, he's out of business, he can't earn a living, and his family will be in a hazard. Can he opt out of those taxes? He cannot. Can you opt out of those flashing lights? You cannot. Can you opt out of the income tax system? You cannot. And I think that categorically speaking, if we address this logically, that means that you are not a free man. secession is the ultimate guarantor of freedom for men, villages, enclaves, states, you name it. If an individual or a number of human beings say, enough is enough, we want to go our own way, and the government ensures that they treat them in a fashion that leads to their fining, caging, maiming, or killing, it's morally wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the possibility of using secession to avoid violence. Ludwig von Mises, in his book Liberalism, he argued that secession was really the only way to avoid warfare and revolution.
You know what? I agree with that 100%. I happen to be an Austrian economist myself. I had the fortune when I went to Humboldt State University in Northern California, which is a university one attends. If you find Berkeley too right-wing and oppressive, you go to Humboldt. But secreted away in the economics department there were two Austrians in the California school system who I cut my teeth on in my learning of economics in the 1980s. What a happy coincidence. What a fortunate happenstance for me to be exposed to that and have my mind shaped in that fashion for freedom.
Yeah, especially earlier in your life like that. That was very fortunate. It's ironic. I had to go halfway around the world to learn about Austrian economics. But now, everyone can do it, from their home computer. So.
Yeah. With the Mises Institute, yes. It's amazing what you can get for free.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, delving into this subject of secession a little more in depth. Are you familiar with Dr. Hans Hermann Hoppe, and he's also another Austrian economist? And some way
I am. Yes. And I have to tell you, I have referred to him in some of my own writing, and my hats are off to him because I think he's an intellectual powerhouse. Mm-hmm. But he has this fixation with monarchy that I don't quite grok or understand, and
right.
it sort of dissuaded me from some of his positions. But anyhow, go ahead. I just wanted to put that disclosure out there.
Right. You're absolutely right. He is somewhat sympathetic. He at least sees monarchy as the lesser of two evils compared to democracy, which you could argue whatever form of government we have today. You could call it republicanism or democratic republicanism or whatever. He argues that monarchy is not as bad.
What we live in is a fascist republic.
Right, I would agree with you on that. Absolutely, I would agree.
Yeah.
But it does seem to be trending more, in some ways, more democratic, and in other ways, it seems to be getting away from democracy. It's a very strange kind of system we live under.
Well, I think democracy is a horrific system, and I'm not sympathetic to Churchill where he said that democracy is awful, but everything else is worse. I don't think that way at all, but I've come to the conclusion in my own lifetime that self-government is the only proper government, and of course that leads to anarchism and such, anarchism being the absence of the state, not chaos, because when you're an Austrian and you read Mises and such, he talks about the fact that chaos is actually what happens when people with very imperfect information, which would be the government, try to plan a society. That's chaos. What the market does with its splendid spontaneous order is it orders things through imperfect information, but it does the single best picture. It does a single best projection of these finite time and resources that it can because it has actual price signals. Absent price signals, all economic allocation is irrational.
That is interesting, bringing those two thoughts together like that. Getting back to secession for a second, before we go on the anarchy, what sort of secession would you endorse? Hoppe has endorsed a piecemeal secession where communities all across the United States and the Western world would individually secede. He argues that would be less intimidating to central governments, that it would be less likely to cause violence than if you had large sections like the South or the West or Scotland or something secede from.
With respect to Dr. Hoppe, he's on crack.
Why is that?
Because we live in a police state. And if you read my blog and if you read the forums, if it weren't for cops, if it weren't for that Praetorian black and blue line, I don't like to call it the blue line, I like to call it the black and blue line because of what they do to us as citizens. If it weren't for them, our freedom wouldn't be in the hazard, Michael. The politicians couldn't do anything. They wouldn't have the teeth. And what will happen if Jarbridge, Nevada, or your little burg in the Carolinas, or my little burg here in Arizona says, you know what, we're not going to pay our taxes, we're not going to comply with the regulations, we're not going to do any of that. You really think that they wouldn't sick every cop they could on us? Because the cops, whether they are local all the way to federal, they are the true hazard to our liberty. There is no greater threat to us as human beings on an everyday basis and on a philosophically free basis than cops. So that's why I think that piecemeal secession, while it may be entertaining to contemplate from an armchair, in the end, they will sick their dogs on us and make us comply, and they'll make that compliance happen like it has with Occupy Wall Street. I don't agree with the Marxoid, economically illiterate protesters in OWS in any city they're at. And I really do think they're complete blithering idiots who are simply looking for bigger government and more handouts. But the way the police have treated nonviolent protesters, that is simply a harbinger of things to come. They will not hesitate to do the wrong thing. I think I was talking to I'm a former sheriff's deputy myself. I'm sort of ashamed to say that. And looking back, I think to myself, you know, what was I thinking by doing that? I was a search and rescue deputy. But nonetheless, when I talk to some of the police acquaintances I have today, one thing I'll mention to them is I'll say, you know what? It's that 97% that give that 3% a bad name as far as behavior is concerned. But,
that's exactly the opposite of what most people claim.
It is, and I think that any of us who have had family members embroiled in the legal system, notice I don't call it the justice system, but the legal system, you find that you are embroiled in a system where when your defendant is standing there, and this happened to a friend of mine recently, he was in the courtroom and his son was standing there with the defense attorney that he paid for, but every other person in that courtroom was a government employee. Wow. Is there a conflict of interest there? Of course there is. Did you know, and you can go back on my blog and you can find the article I wrote about this. I've written several. Did you know that at the peak of Stalin's gulags, in which there were both criminal and political prisoners, that we are at 3 times that level for our total number of probationers, parolees, and jailed offenders?
No, I didn't know that.
We have the largest per capita prison population on earth. And we also have 92% of the people who are in the federal penitentiary are in there for either victimless crimes or nonviolent crimes. That's terrific. Because it's not only those 7 million plus who are actually caged or paroled or chained in some fashion. It's also the family members that they affect.
That's a good point. It does. I've seen that. I've seen it firsthand in my own extended family. The way that the legal system, as you call it, really destroys families, and it's just. You know,
I think you're right. We've all been touched by it, where we can go to friends or family at random, and find. I would say almost every one of them has a story to tell, like that. And you know, the cops. It used to be about criminality, maybe back in the dark ages of America, you know, back in the early 20th century. But now it's all about criminality. It's all about obedience. It's not about criminality. I mean, if you fly an aircraft and you go through TSA, or any meeting you have with the cops. Down here where I am, we have suspicionless checkpoints manned by the Border Patrol and Customs, 60 miles from the Mexican border, that I have to go through, where they ask me what my citizenship is. And if I don't stop for these, those flashing red lights will be in my rear view soon after I have departed. Now, the reason I went on that, Michael, I'm sorry for that segue. The reason I went on that is it's my explanation of why Dr. Hoppe, who I have the greatest respect for, why I think piecemeal secession is a non-starter.
So what would you propose then as an alternative? Because I know that you like the idea of secession and you want to see the central state eliminated. What do you propose?
Well, I don't think there's any way to peacefully have secession. I think that if we look back through history, from Roman times, the Babylonian times, the Greeks, and through the Middle Ages and all the way up to this time, you find that it is usually born of violence. Now, that's regrettable. But there is one way that it happens whereby that violence may not have to happen, and that would be a collapse of an economic system or a currency. And I'm here to tell you, and you're a cautious and savvy Austrian observer. You and I both know that our economy is going to collapse. It isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Now, when it collapses, Mordor on the Potomac is going to lose their grip on a lot of America. And if one state, let's suppose it's Texas, if one state leaves, Katie, bar the door, because you're going to see a huge cavalcade of states, municipalities, counties, stuff like that, heading for the door and trying to find a way out from under Mordor's thumb.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. I've said that for a number of years now, that once the state goes, that'll be the end of the system. That I don't see the Feds being able to hold things together at that point.
I don't think they can. When you look at federal police forces, for instance, there's a whole lot of armed federal agents, but they're quite outnumbered by the number of American people who are out there. So they would have a hard time doing it unless they can find a way to cow the population. I think today the Majority candidate, McCain, and his cronies approved the military detention policy of U.S. citizens.
I know. How onerous, how disgusting. That's just awful.
One thing I find enlightening about it, though, is at least they're exposing their fangs. At least they're not saying, it's for your safety, it's for the children, and all the other noxious nostrums they use to rationalize and support their tyranny. At least they're coming out and saying, well, the bottom line is we're going to maintain control. I think there's something called SOPA concerning the Internet. Senator Lieberman went to Google and said, we want you to undo the processes by which those people we consider terrorists have blocked. And that's not going to stop. This kind of assault on freedom of expression and such. The Internet has unleashed from its Pandora's box this huge cavalcade of resentment and alternate views of how political systems are made and different philosophies and such. I have the pleasure of being able to go to Southern News. I have the pleasure of being able to go to SNN and reviewing the stuff that you pen, and I enjoy it thoroughly. If it were up to the SLPC, you wouldn't exist.
That's true. That's true. In fact, it's interesting you bring up that point, because I was reading a newspaper yesterday, and I know that seems incredibly old-fashioned. I never do that anymore. But my grandfather, he gets a newspaper subscription, and I went there, and I was thumbing through it. And the thing that struck me was the different world that it seemed to be reporting on than the world that I read about online. And it really struck me whereas if a few years ago I would have no way to know what I know now about what's going on in Italy or Greece or even right here in my own state. And the image I've got from reading that paper was that things are basically okay. Things are fine. The people in charge are taking care of things, and there's nothing to worry about. And when
Amen, brother.
And that world just totally collides, and it seems exactly the opposite of what I read about online. Do you get the same impression? I don't know if you ever read the newspaper, but that's the impression I got.
I don't because it's so disgusting. But I have a challenge to all your listeners and your audience. Is next time you see one of your local newspapers, what I want you to do is count the number of ads that are taken out by a government entity. Because what you will discover is that the government supports a lot of these newspapers by taking out ads, your local government, whatever the case may be. Where I live here in southern Arizona, our local government it's a microcosm of the large government because it is rife with nepotism, corruption, irresponsible spending, increased taxes, increased valuations on properties that are actually decreasing in valuation for tax monies and such. But the newspapers, they will rarely, if ever, do an investigative report on the chicanery within the local government. or the county government for such.
Right.
Now, I suspect, I'm extrapolating here, I suspect this is a universal phenomenon across the fruited plain. And that if they were to criticize the government, they're concerned about two things. Number one, they would lose ad revenue. But number two, it is so easy for a local government, or even the federal government for that matter, to come into a business and shut them down due to regulatory violations that they can concoct.
That's a good point. Is also a factor, I think, as well, is that a lot of their sources for the news, and I put that in quotation marks, that they report, is directly what they're told by government officials. So they report what this bureaucrat says, and that's what people read in their paper. That's what goes.
That's a great point. And you know what the government PR machine will do is they know that most journalists are stupid, venal, and lazy. Mencken part, they can say, hey, listen, Fred, when they call the writer at the New York Times or the Washington Post or something. Listen, Fred, here's the article. Here's the byline, but you can change that byline and have a drink on me tonight. Because of it, you'll note, how often have you listened to the news, for instance, and you've heard them say, the following study said such and such, and usually they're outlandishly stupid studies. But you will find that the lion's share of these outlandishly stupid studies are paid for with money that's been lifted from our wallets.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. Or they'll say, this official said this, but that official said that, and then that's it. That's the end of the story. Very disturbing. That's not news.
It is. And I'm so happy for sites like antiwar.com, for instance, which is where I go to.
Right, great stuff.
That's the first place I go to every morning. And then Lou Rockwell, and of course I have to go to SNN and review the news there, and then tend to my own little garden plot at my blog. But I don't have the width and depth and breadth of coverage that you do on yours. Usually we're pretty single focused, and at ZeroGov we're single focused on trying to bring about a stateless society. So we have a very narrow, laser-like perspective on what we're trying to achieve, whereas yours and antiwar.com and Lou Rockwell and such have a broader menu before them as far as what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. And if we have time, I know we're going to run over a little bit, but I wanted to just for a second explore what you mean by a stateless society. Is that what you mean by anarchy? Because when people use the word anarchy, a lot of times people kind of cringe. They say, oh, no, and they think of someone in a black outfit with a hood over their head throwing a Molotov
who's destroying private capitalist property.
Right.
You know what? I'll tell you what. I do use the term anarchy among anarchists because they understand it. But the term that I've adopted to use for more general consumption is I call myself an abolitionist. And what I'm trying to do is not only carry on William Wilberforce's charter from the late 18th century and early 19th century in abolishing slavery within the British Empire, when he said that the ownership of other human beings is wrong. All I'm trying to do is expand his charter 100% and establish that self-ownership should be the uppermost virtue every human aspires to and attains. And self-ownership cannot exist as long as there is a government with a gun who can tell me what to do, and that if I don't comply with it, they may kidnap me, they may fine me, they may cage me, they may maim me, they may kill me. And they keep convincing me that I've signed on to that contract, and I happen to disagree with that. But then again, if you read my blog, and this goes into another rather controversial subject, you know I'm not a fan of the Constitution, and I've spoken out against it, and I've had speaking engagements and such. And I think the Constitution, which is so idolized by folks both on the left and the right, both individualist and collectivist, I find that is almost a perfect engine for big government, and we're getting exactly what we deserve with it.
That is one thing that I agree with you on that. By the way, I do think I do take a dim view of the U.S. Constitution, and my view is the same as Robert Barnwell Rhett. He said that it was an experiment of combining different people with different industries and different persuasions under one government and it had failed. And
it failed, which is why the War of Northern Aggression was Revolution number 2.
Well,
absolutely,
Mr. Buppert, this is it's fascinating talking with you. I'd love to talk with you again about some of these issues, explore them even further if you'd be up for that sometime.
I am honored, Michael, and I just wanted to put a plug in for you. Those folks in your audience, of course, if they've discovered you, they're probably reading SNN and everything like that. But you are an inspiration to me because of at your young and tender age, young and tender compared to me, the enterprise that you've embarked upon, the hours and man days of labor that you put into that glorious site and such, and of course I enjoy your presence on the forum. You're always welcome there. I would urge your listeners, if they get a chance, to come to zerogov.com and also to visit our forum, which can be accessed via a tab in the upper right of my blog. And we welcome all comers because even if you don't agree with us, I would urge you guys to come on board and get involved in our pretty lively discussions, because if you don't agree with us, it'll make us either stronger or maybe we'll come around to superior evidence, because cross-examination is the engine of truth, and that's what we're seeking here in the end.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed my time on the site, and I would encourage the audience to check out zerogov.com. And Mr. Buppert, thank you again. It's been great talking with you.
It's been an honor. Thank you, Michael.